You are listening to the Neurocareers, Doing the Impossible podcast with Dr. K, episode number 28. Dear Neurocareers podcast listeners, Happy New Year 2023. Let it become a healthy Neuro Year 2023 for you and your loved ones. Welcome to our New Year podcast that is all about speech and language pathology and its relation to the science of our brain. I want to welcome Dr. Corinne Jones, who is a licensed speech-language pathologist in the MUVA Clinic for the Neurosciences. Welcome, Corinne. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you please briefly introduce yourself and also tell us where you are joining us from? Our podcast is international and people are joining us from different parts of the world.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here. As you said, I'm Corinne Jones. I started off as a speech-language pathologist, and I am lucky to still be practicing today. I'm also an assistant professor and director of the Swallowing Modulation Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. So I'm joining you from beautiful, sunny Austin, Texas today.
That's beautiful. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about your program, about the university, so that people from other countries would know what it is. Maybe some fact that not many people know, or some interesting thing that, would somehow characterize the place where you work.
Yeah, so Austin is a vibrant city in Texas. It's the capital city. And we have the flagship University of Texas here. An interesting fact and something that helped me in my decision to come to UT is that we have a brand new med school. So the medical school, it initially was founded in 2016, and we actually just graduated our fourth class of medical students. So I joined the university in 2018, and we have been in a period of growth. We like to think of ourselves as a startup medical school. So we have a small program. We only have 50 medical students in each class. We actually have boiled down the time that the students take class into a quick 18 months. And then the whole third year of the program is kind of an open year for students to pursue research activities or clinical service activities, or even do things such as get an MBA or an MPH. So we have a unique value-based medicine focused med school here. Actually, that's the reason why I was interested in coming to UT when I did, because in my field, the field of speech-language pathology, my subfield is in swallowing and swallowing disorders. And it can be really hard to have a research program at a university that's not associated with a medical school. So UT has been in existence for hundreds of years without a medical school, and we have a brand new one. And so that's an exciting new thing about UT.
Yes, thank you so much, Corinne. And I absolutely agree. This new program, like many new programs, provides unique opportunities. This is very important from a standpoint of choosing your place of building your career. Some people, they are thinking that joining old, already very established programs is more preferable. However, I think that the new starting programs sometimes offer more opportunities for growth and establishing something unique that you want to pursue. Can you tell our listeners from your own experience, what opportunities did this new program provide in terms of doing research and also having your clinical practice?
Yes. So, there are certainly some challenges coming into a newly established program. But like you said, there's opportunities to kind of set your own path and to set up things how you want them to be seen. I think a really big innovation killer is, the phrase, that's how things have always been done. Whereas if you're in a new program, things haven't been done because it's new. And so then you can set things up in the way and kind of set yourself up for success. It's certainly a risk because, being a new faculty, I'm having to do a lot of learning and how to set things up appropriately. But an example of kind of how my view has shifted is just being within a neurology department. So typically speech pathology in medical settings is housed within ear, nose, and throat, otolaryngology, ENT. But our university, our med school doesn't currently have an ENT department. We are in the process of planning to develop one, but I needed a place to start off with, and coming into a neurology practice was kind of a unique way of starting this practice and has kind of shifted how I think about treating swallowing disorders.
Thank you very much, Corinne. And now about the work you do, speech and language pathology, and specifically your specialization, yes, in swallowing. Can you tell our listeners what is it? What do you do? And also maybe what is its relationship to neuroscience or to the science of our brain?
Yeah. Speech language pathology doesn't include swallowing anywhere in it, but we are the rehab profession that is most responsible for assessing and treating the process of eating and drinking from the lips to the top of the esophagus. It fell into our lap versus occupational therapy or physical therapy because we know the anatomy and physiology of the head and neck the best of those specializations. It's not something that is, commonly thought of when thinking about speech language pathology, or commonly, seen in medical dramas or talked about in the news. But it's something that kind of piqued my attention when I was in graduate school. So to be a speech pathologist in the US, you have to get a master's degree. We had a whole course on swallowing and swallowing disorders. And just the process of, the physiology of eating and drinking is really interesting to me. And, even more important is helping people who have lost the ability or haven't correctly developed the ability to eat and drink, helping them, get to a place where they can enjoy the foods and drinks that they like is really meaningful. If you think of whatever comfort food or comfort drink you turn to after a hard day. If you have a stroke or head and neck cancer, you might get to a point where you've lost that. Swallowing is a sensory motor task, just like any other motor tasks that we do. It's interesting because it has kind of a semi-reflexive motor control. So anything we do in the mouth is voluntary. So if I, take a sip of coffee, hold it on my tongue, swallow it down, or if I, take a bite of a cookie and I chew it around, that's all under voluntary control. But, if you hear about the swallowing reflex, or there's a certain point in the throat where it's an all or nothing patterned response. It's controlled by a central pattern generator in the brainstem. There's a lot of different health conditions, including, a brainstem stroke or even a cortical stroke, anything impacting the brain or any of the motor control system can impact swallowing and swallowing disorders. And so, that, really tight control between, that motor control, how the brain controls the sensation in the muscles in the mouth and the throat is really what got me interested in more of the neuroscience of the things. Because as a clinician, I can see what's going wrong in the throat, but really in order to help someone, I need to understand what's going on in the brain in order to then change what's functioning in the throat.
Thank you very much, Corinne. And what I'm very curious about, first of all, where did you come from to this profession of speech and language pathology? Did you know when you were growing up that you want to do something with speech and language? How did you make this choice to pursue this path in your career?
Yeah, so I actually went to speech therapy as a kid. Was otherwise typically developing, but was slow to be able to pronounce my R's and my L sounds. And so in kindergarten, I was pulled out of my class and I went to speech therapy. It was a really positive experience for me. And then, I had kind of not really thought about it much. And then in high school, we had to do a careers class and a careers project. I wasn't super thrilled about that, but I did it anyways. And I knew I wanted to be in kind of the health professions. I wanted to help people, but I wasn't as interested in like the rigor that went into going to med school. Also, my interest, I had, interest in learning language and kind of the patterns behind language. And so I did a couple different foreign languages in high school. And so that kind of combination of those two things, brought me to speech pathology. And actually, that was my careers project in high school, is speech pathology. From there, I guess I stuck with it. I did an undergrad degree in linguistics, again because I had that interest in language, but I did a minor in speech pathology, just knowing that going to grad school to be a clinician, that was my path. And so I did my undergrad at Boston University, and then I did my master's program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it was really in that master's program that I had access or had exposure to swallowing and swallowing disorders. We call that dysphagia. And, taking the coursework and seeing patients and really seeing the really large impact we can have on the patient and their families' lives kind of drew me into that. And so I did my, further clinical training in swallowing and swallowing disorders. I worked in a research lab and then transitioned from there into getting my PhD. Since there is, as I described, this really tight connection between neural control and swallowing disorders, I actually decided to do a joint PhD in speech pathology and neurosciences. So I could get that depth of information to then better ask and answer questions that will, result in clinicians being able to better assess and treat swallowing disorders.
Yes, thank you. Actually, that was one of my questions, that you didn't stop at just completing the speech and language pathology, but you went ahead and you completed your degree in neuroscience. So you are a highly specialized professional now. Also, one connection with the brain and neuroscience is the population that you are working with. Yes, so it's patients with Parkinson's disease. I watched your TED Talk and listened to some of your lectures that our listeners can find on YouTube. So we can refer them there. And where you talk about this, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about this side of the work you do? And also maybe a couple of words about the complexity of swallowing that you so beautifully described in your TED Talk, that we are even not understanding all the complexity. We really take it for granted. Yes, but actually there's so much involved in this seemingly simple process. So
certainly, yeah, I'll start with that. So yeah, in order to get a sip of coffee or a bite of cookie from the lips to the esophagus, maybe 15 centimeters, however tall you are, it takes activation, like, really precise coordination of activation of more than 31 paired muscle groups in the head and neck, with sensory and motor information traveling over 6 cranial nerves. Yeah, like I said, it's very complex, and we have this kind of pattern generator in the brainstem, but we can actually volitionally change how we swallow. So if you just take a sip of liquid, as I will right now, you just take a sip and you don't even really think about how things go down. But you can also take a sip and hold the liquid in your mouth and hold and hold and then swallow. So we can change some of the things. Or you could even take a sip of liquid in your mouth and swallow and really squeeze all of the muscles and use the effort that you would need to like swallow a golf ball whole. So there are some volitional things that we can do that modulate how that central pattern generator works to control the muscles and the timing and the activation. There's only a certain amount of things that we can control. Like we can't swallow and activate the muscles in reverse order. We can't swallow if there's absolutely nothing to be swallowed. So if you've ever tried to, swallow your saliva with a really dry mouth, it's quite difficult. So we actually need that sensory stimulation there in order to swallow. And yeah, again, I think it's something that's just really taken for granted. Like we go through our day and we eat and drink the things that we want. We actually, subconsciously swallow our saliva throughout the day, even when we sleep. And that's, a kind of a subconscious process. We generate about 1 liter of saliva a day. And so that has to get swallowed. And if something goes wrong, then that saliva builds up. It either will pour out of our mouth, as in drool, or could be sent down the wrong pipe. So one of the consequences of swallowing incorrectly is that the airway, the trachea, is right next to the esophagus. And as we are breathing, our airway has to be open, but when we swallow, we have to close. And there are multiple different levels of airway protection. And so since everything is so complex, there's a lot of different ways that things can go wrong. And I think one of the big questions in the field now is, how can we describe the differences in how things go wrong? So if someone has Parkinson's disease, so that's an extrapyramidal disease, particularly involving the basal ganglia, though we know that earlier in the progression, different brainstem regions can be involved, and later in the progression, different cortical regions can be involved. But we have this kind of pattern of signs, motor and motor signs that we see in the limbs, but we don't really have necessarily a way to describe that in the throat during swallowing. Comparing, say, this dysphagia, the swallowing disorder due to Parkinson's disease versus, a stroke in the left hemisphere. From a limb motor control standpoint, the neurologist would very easily be able to decipher, someone who has had a stroke versus someone who has Parkinson's disease. And we're not quite there yet in swallowing in the throat. So that's kind of one area of my research interest. Another area is, again, within Parkinson's disease, it's a progressive neurodegenerative condition. So, neurons in these different brain regions are becoming affected by the neuropathology of Parkinson's disease and are, dying. And then that results in the motor signs and symptoms that we observe in our patients. Since it's progressive, we know that, things are changing in the brain early on. Actually, even by the time someone gets diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, up to 50% of the neurons in the substantia nigra have already died. So again, it's slowly progressing from there. Typically, people think of swallowing disorders as occurring late in the progression of Parkinson's disease. That's because, the body's really good at compensating when things go wrong. And there are several sensory changes in Parkinson's disease as well, even cognitive changes. So, if you experience a difficulty or a symptom in any part of the body, reporting that to a physician might be challenging. So with improvements in our diagnostic tools for swallowing, we've been able to show that there are really subtle changes in swallowing physiology earlier on. So throughout my lab's current research, we are doing some work to classify how that change progresses over time longitudinally. From there, we can do some prediction of who might develop a swallowing disorder and when. And then we can also develop tools that will help us to rehabilitate the swallow before the disease has progressed to, a later stage when doing some of these rehabilitation programs might be more difficult.
Thank you very much. And what happens if the swallowing disorder progresses? What can people expect, and why do we care about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, the food tube, the esophagus is right next to the air tube, the trachea. And so, if things are, moving very slowly through the mouth and the throat, if we're not protecting our airway enough, if there's residue left over, once the airway opens again, then that material can spill into the airway. We call that aspiration. If that food or liquid mixes with bacteria in the oral cavity, it can cause a pneumonia. We call that aspiration pneumonia. And in Parkinson's disease, as well as several other neurodegenerative conditions, aspiration pneumonia is the leading cause of death. So, in theory, if we can, prevent or work to minimize the risk of developing aspiration pneumonia, then we could potentially prolong someone's life and reduce the causes of death in these populations. Furthermore, if we intervene, we can improve one's ability to continue eating and drinking the foods that they like. So some foods can be a little bit more difficult to swallow than others. For some individuals, more softer things or less viscous things, so things like thin liquids are harder to control. And so then they splash around a little bit more and aren't more easily splashed into the airway. And so those are more difficult. For other individuals, the harder, thicker foods take more energy to push through. And so then those can also be more difficult. So, one option that we have as speech pathologists to help with people with dysphagia is we can change the foods and liquids that people are eating. So we can make liquids thicker by adding different thickening agents, or we can make solid foods softer by putting them in the blender or, cutting them up really small or just kind of disallowing certain foods like steak. So again, thinking back to those comfort foods, you might have some of those things that are really enjoyable to you that are on those ends of the spectrum. And so if you're told, you cannot have your morning coffee, or you can have your morning coffee, but it has to be the consistency of honey, then that's going to lead to reduced quality of life. And so, if we call it liberalizing a diet, if we can let people eat and drink the things that they want for a longer amount of time, we can have some other profound impacts as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to tell our listeners where I met you. First time, it was a summer school on adaptive neurotechnologies in a Woodward Center in New York. And it showed me your interest in technology in general. Yes, and neurotechnology. So I want to start with technology and then move to neurotechnology. I saw that through specialization from speech and language pathology, then to neuroscience, and then specialized in swallowing disorders, and then in a special technique that is called high resolution pharyngeal manometry. Can you tell our listeners what it is? How is it more advantageous than other techniques? And also, why did you choose this specific technique to specialize in? Why not anything other than that?
Great. Yeah. So, if you go to the mirror and you swallow and you look at yourself, there's really only a few things that you can see. You might see your lips clench a little bit. If you look really closely, you might see muscles underneath your chin bulge. And then if you look at your Adam's apple, that will certainly rise and fall. You could also do things like if you press the tongue on the inside of your cheek, you could press against it with your hand and get kind of a sense of how strong those muscles are. But really, those 31 pairs of muscles are buried deep within the mouth and throat and are hard to assess. I get jealous of my OT and my PT colleagues where they're looking at these big muscles and they can, do an exam pretty easily. So, in order to assess what's going on in the mouth and the throat during swallowing, we need technologies. kind of the bread and butter technology is a video X-ray swallow study. So you go and you get a video X-ray and you eat and drink foods and liquids that have contrast in it. And so we can see how the structures are moving, where the contrast goes, where it doesn't go, if it moves completely or if there's residue left over. And that's a really clinically important tool and has been used since the 60s in order to assess swallowing function. But for research, data analysis is pretty laborious because it is an image, a video. And so a lot of the established techniques require manual analysis or, different rating scales. And so it's time intensive to do that work, and then is subject to a reliability concern. So if I, outline the contrast in a certain region that's left over, and you outline that contrast in a certain region that's left over, depending on our time and our experience, we might get different values. Also, a lot of, some of our really important clinical tools, things that I use and love in clinic are the rating scales. And so like a 0 to 4 scale. And so, if I'm testing out a certain treatment, a patient might start, kind of at the lower end of a 3, but then end at kind of a higher end of the 3. But then when I go to do my statistics, they go from a 3 to a 3, no change. Those are some of the issues with that X-ray technology. There's another technology where we put a camera up the nose and watch the swallow from above. And has similar issues because that's, again, image-based. The high-resolution pharyngeal manometry measures pressures in the throat during swallowing. So it's a small tube. It has pressure sensors on it. It's fed up through the nose, swallowed down through the throat into the esophagus. And then when we swallow, we actively engage our muscles to push the food or liquid down. And that presses on that pressure sensor, and then we get pressure data. So it's complementary to the X-ray data. We don't get the same amount of information, but it is objective. So it's pressure data. So if I measure a maximum pressure on a certain sensor and you measure a maximum pressure on a certain sensor, we're going to get the same value. Also, we can, more easily write algorithms to measure, to, get a lot of different metrics out of a study very quickly and reliably. There are some algorithms on the X-ray data, but those are a bit more complex. So, for example, I can very easily write a MATLAB code, extract, pressure data from the different sensors and get that. And since it's pressure data, it's a continuous data set instead of a Likert rating scale. And so where my patient might go from the lower end of a 3 to a higher end of a 3, if my patient goes from, a pressure of 125 millimeters of mercury to a pressure of 150 millimeters of mercury, might not be a huge change, but it's something measurable or more discretely measurable. And so then I can make that change.
Yes, thank you. How did you find this fairly unique specialization in this particular technique?
Yeah, so it was a little bit serendipity. It was kind of pioneered by one of my mentors, Dr. Tim McCullough, who is an otolaryngologist, an ENT doctor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and that is where I got my master's degree. And so while I was a master's student, I saw a presentation that he gave on this technique. And actually, after I had graduated with my master's degree, he had a position open as a lab manager. And so I applied to that position and I got hired into the lab. So I did that at the same time I did my clinical fellowship training. And that, kind of set me up to help with some of the pioneering work that he did in the lab. Initially, my job, was to sit at a computer and look at these pressure plots and kind of figure out what the data meant. So it was, really fun and exciting work for me to kind of, learn programming along the way to figure out how we can extract the information from this pressure signal quickly and reliably, and to figure out, how it changes if in a healthy individual, if they swallow, a small volume of liquid versus a large volume of liquid, or a healthy individual versus someone with Parkinson's disease, kind of doing a lot of that initial work. And then going forward, I can use this as a tool to, again, describe subtle changes in swallowing function or changes before and after therapies.
Mhm. Thank you very much. And I'm very curious, do you think that specializing in a very unique technique like you did and in this type of analysis helped you in certain way to progress in your career? Maybe you had some opportunities that wouldn't be available if you wouldn't be knowledgeable in this unique area.
Certainly. It is a relatively new technique. And so I had the opportunity, to get in at an early time in using this technique. And I had the flexibility in my position at the time to really dive in and do some of that foundational work and get that expertise as I was, a pre-PhD student and a PhD student. And so kind of having that experience, let me speak with expertise to, people who are at a more advanced position than I was. I think with any kind of technology, we want to make sure that we're not just doing something because it hasn't been done on a certain technology. So in Dr. McCullough's lab, and I continue this in my lab, is that we have to be grounded in the physiology and in the outcomes that we're interested in. So not just, measuring a change just because no one's published on it, but, really how is that going to change our clinical practice? What knowledge is this going to add to the body of literature? And, staying grounded in the physiology really made our work, very clinically applicable. And then we can, make the argument and why this tool, should be used in a clinical way. It's not just, a research tool that was, built in our lab. So the tools that we use are commercially available. And I think that's really important for translation of the work. I have read a lot of papers in which, people develop these really cool sensors, but they just kind of built it in their lab. And it's like, okay, well, I want to do this work in my population. Like, how can I get that sensor? And so working with technologies, it's not just about the tool, but then the why of why you're using it, and then making it available so that other people can use it and, to have a meaningful clinical difference.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is something that was also emphasized in that summer school on adaptive neurotechnologies, where we met that it should be really clinically relevant. You should see patients, real patients, not just create some problem that might potentially exist somewhere. Yes. And also they were showing all the way until commercializing the systems that are being developed. So speaking about that school and your interest in neurotechnologies, how did that interest develop, and maybe how neurotechnologies can be applied to the field of speech and language pathology?
Yeah. So again, I think as I was saying, I really am taking a view of what is going to be able to be used by the clinician who's working at a small community hospital in rural Texas. Without a lot of outside training or special equipment, special expensive equipment, but is going to have really meaningful clinical impacts. So initially, after our summer school, I was getting really excited about TMS, and I have a TMS system, but again, with muscles of swallowing, they're again very, very deep within, and it's hard to thinking of where the motor homunculus is, where the tongue has a pretty big representation, but to get at the muscles in the throat, which are hard to access from a rehab standpoint, that can be pretty difficult to locate with TMS. Also, TMS, while it's FDA approved for clinical use, it's FDA approved just for depression. And there are specialized TMS centers. So I think not to downplay the importance of TMS, but just with the amount of training that would need to go in to apply that, might make it difficult for this technology to be used by a large swath of clinicians out there, just with the level of training that we have. So within the last couple of years, there's been a lot of interest in transcutaneous auricular vagal nerve stimulation. Like I had discussed before, the major swallowing centers are within the brainstem. So also, if TMS, you can only access the cortex. So with transcutaneous auricular vagal nerve stimulation, you put a stimulator on the ear, on the outside of the ear, and then that sends stimulation directly into the brainstem through the vagus nerve into an area called the nucleus solitarius. And that's actually part of that central pattern generator framework for swallowing. So that nucleus solitarius is the main sensory input for the swallowing network. So that is, a lot easier to apply instead of, say doing a structural MRI to get a map of the cortex and finding the hot spots on the cranium and, trying to measure EMGs from deep within the throat. With TMS, we can, clip a stimulator to the outside of the ear. We want to make sure that we're monitoring heart rate and making sure the patient's safe, but we can access deep areas within the brainstem in a really easy way. This technique is very new to the application in swallowing disorders, and so does need quite a bit of testing still, and that's something that us in the lab and a few other groups are looking into. But it is something that eventually could be more easily applied by the garden variety clinician out in the trenches.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for explaining. And of course, I wish you all the best with the studies that you are doing to make sure this technique works and can be easily used. We will be looking forward to your updates on this.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I became very curious through so many different experiences and knowledge that you acquired, going from broader perspective from language and towards swallowing disorders, and now various techniques that can help you learn so much. What was the most unexpected thing that you learned throughout these years of experience?
That's a great question. Really the most impactful thing is knowing what effect this work can have on the patient. So as you mentioned, this was talked about in summer school, and then coming as a clinician, I think it's so important to take those opportunities to go into a clinic, even, doing shadowing, for those without clinical backgrounds, to get a sense of that population. What kind of experiences are they going through? What's their perspective? What things are important to them? Because even coming as a clinician standpoint, the things that I think might be most important to my patients are actually not as important. So I think, some of the times that I've been surprised is, I see a patient and they have, really severe communication disorders, really severe swallowing disorders, really severe motor control problems. But, the thing that bothers them the most is their, urinary control. And so then kind of having to take a step back and to step out of my biases coming in and to really let the patient drive their care and make, known the things that are most important to them.
Absolutely. So patient-centered, and the same way we're talking about evidence-based practice, that it should incorporate the patient and the patient's needs, first of all. So the combination of both. Yes, very good. And as we are concentrating a little bit on neurotechnologies and neuroscience in this podcast, I'm wondering maybe you can talk about what became possible with the development of technologies in the recent maybe 10, 20 years in the field of speech pathology that wasn't possible before. maybe there is something that we couldn't offer. Maybe there was something that we couldn't offer to our patients, let's say 10 years ago, but with this development, now we have this opportunity to help them even more than we were able before.
Yeah, so as we discussed, pharyngeal high resolution manometry is a relatively new technology. The first paper using it was published in 2010, which might seem like a long time ago, but in the field of clinical sciences was just yesterday. And so that gives us a whole new area to explore. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. And then again, with the development of lots of different new technologies, I think, things that are kind of on the cusp is kind of looking at multivariate or multivariables, how physiologic systems work together. Currently, the easy way to design studies is you have your primary outcome and you do an intervention, and then you have your before value and your after value, and then you compare. But we talked about swallowing as this really complex, multivariate thing. And, we might be leaving some things on the table if we're only measuring one or two things. And so with the development and the advancement of more sophisticated, more advanced statistical techniques, particularly in the AI or machine learning space, that has the power to, do some really interesting, really meaningful predictive modeling. So, given what we know about how stroke impacts the brain, say, given this particular stroke in this particular region, in a man of this age with a 10-year smoking history and this educational history, we might be able to predict what we might see. And then, we might then be able to predict what treatments would have the best outcomes for that. This is still, very early in its development and not quite ready for clinical use, but something that can be really meaningful and to augment the clinician's ability to assess and diagnose and plan treatment. It's certainly not going to replace the clinician, but just having the ability to interpret multiple streams of data and can be really impactful.
Thank you so much. And there is a question that is related to what you were just talking about, looking into the future. Let's say 50 years from now, how do you see the field of speech and language pathology, maybe in relation to technologies and maybe neurotechnologies as well? And maybe how do you want to see it? Yes, how do you see and how do you want to see? I don't know if those two overlap. So
I think, certainly with the development and advancement of neurotechnologies, there's, some really cool things that could change clinical practice, not just in speech pathology, but in lots of other fields, is that, the more data that we can get and the better our algorithms can be in processing that data, that can really help us, do some of these diagnostics. In kind of the field of Parkinsonism, there are lots of other conditions that initially look like Parkinson's disease, but as time progresses and as different symptoms come up, they're actually different. And so currently, there's really not a standard neuroimaging or a standard even blood or CSF diagnostic test for Parkinson's disease versus some of the other conditions that look like Parkinson's disease. So it's very much a clinical diagnosis. And so there are, a lot of rapidly developing technologies that can really help pinpoint that diagnosis. And that appropriate diagnosis will help us understand what's going wrong in the brain. And then we can target and tailor our therapies, whether they're drugs or rehab, in order to, combat and address what things are going on in the brain. There's, certainly a lot of other work in the field of neurodegeneration for disease-modifying treatments. So, stopping the progression of Parkinson's or ALS, which is certainly not possible now. But I think in concert with that work, we need to develop tools to how to, best treat the people who have and will develop these diseases while we also search for a cure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And our podcast is also about careers. Yes, we have emphasis. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think were the main challenges for you in developing your career, getting to the place where you are now? And what did you do to overcome those challenges?
Yeah. So, with anyone else in science and in academia, I suffer from a good amount of imposter syndrome, and just reckoning with that. But I think I've kind of learned to embrace that, to understand what I don't know, and to kind of use those questions and feeling like, I don't belong in order to really push myself, however healthy mentally that might be. It's worked out well to know that, I'm constantly striving to learn more, addressing my inabilities. I think it can be really powerful to say, no, I haven't read that article. No, I haven't heard of this technique. Tell me more, that kind of thing. One other hard but very important lesson I've learned is that I can't do everything. Starting off as a PhD student, I really wanted to do everything. And that's probably why I pushed myself into doing a joint PhD. But, learning more about like the engineering side behind the neurotechnologies, just knowing that, I don't have the time or the mental energy to learn or to understand this. And so I need to develop my skills in working on a team and finding good collaborators and getting people excited about the work I want to do in order to do that. So, yeah, kind of combining that inability to do everything with the imposter syndrome, is bringing together a team and really trying to work on everyone's strengths. I tell my students, like, don't ever say you're just the speech pathologist, because like you have this specialized training that no one else in the room has, and you really need to own that.
Yes, absolutely. And what does it take for a person to get into this field and to become a successful speech and language pathologist?
Yeah, so in order to practice as a speech language pathologist in the US, you need to complete a master's degree. You don't necessarily need an undergraduate in speech pathology, though they do offer that. Programs are often called speech language hearing sciences or communication sciences and disorders. And that feeds both into speech language pathology and audiology. Audiology is focusing on the hearing mechanism instead of the speech and language mechanisms. There are several programs that offer, they're called leveling classes. And so, if you've had a degree in neuroscience or a degree in music or a degree in psychology, you take a year of coursework with a kind of foundational work and then do a 2-year master's degree. It's a clinical degree, and so it's a mix of coursework and clinical experiences, so clinical externships. And then after the master's degree, you need to complete a 9-month clinical fellowship. So it's kind of akin to a medical residency where you're actually practicing as a clinician, but you're doing so in a supervised way. And after that, you're a licensed certified speech language pathologist. One thing I really like about the degree is that you could practice in lots of different settings. So you could practice, doing speech and language work in public schools. You could work in hospitals, assessing communication and swallowing after people have had certain events. They go into patients' homes, throughout the age range from birth to 100 plus years in order to deliver service in the home setting. People have private practices and so can develop their business skills along with that. And then people could even do kind of field adjacent work. So I know a few speech pathologists who do accent modification. So, to train people to speak with a more standardized American accent, if that's what they want, or even go and work in Hollywood and train actors to have an authentic Australian accent, for example.
Yes, those are exciting opportunities. Actually, I worked with speech and language pathologist. It was my first exposure of speech and language pathology in this country. I worked on my Lithuanian accent. So, yes, I still have it, but it's not as strong. And I think now I'm okay with it. I think now it's beautiful after working.
Oh, it's gorgeous. And I can understand 100% of what you were trying to say to me. And that is the goal.
Yes, but it was a pleasure to work actually with speech and language pathologist on that. And until that time, I even didn't know that that's possible, that it's possible to work on the accent, and actually speech and language pathologist can help with that. So it was at Cincinnati Children's Medical Center, which was amazing. And now I want to talk a little bit about experiences you are getting in going to study different places, like we mentioned already, adaptive neurotechnology school. I know that you've been to Japan, you've been to other different places. How important is this, going to different places, even internationally, to enrich your practice? What does it bring to your patients, to your practice? And also, how does it impact your career as a speech and language pathologist?
Yeah, so I think in any field, it's really important to make those connections and to really go out of your comfort zone and to see how things are done in other places. So if you are fortunate enough to travel and attend conferences or attend workshops, you can meet a lot of really interesting people who you might not have. You'll learn a lot about how the same problems are addressed in different ways in different cultures, and how that impacts the outcomes of the patients. I really recommend to my students to try to go out and attend conferences that are not speech pathology conferences. And so, that can be uncomfortable, going to a place where there's a lot of people and you don't know anyone. But you kind of have to force yourself to get out of your comfort zone and shake people's hands, and get into some discussions, and represent where you're coming from. So there have been conferences I've been to where I've been the only speech pathologist, and you know get up to the mic and ask questions, and let people know who you are, and let people know that you're open for discussion, and for learning more. And I think that just again kind of brings in that kind of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach to whatever work you're doing.
And also, I wanted to ask you about your TED Talk. How did it happen, and how much effort did it take for you to prepare for this talk? And what impact maybe did you see it had on also on your career, maybe in one way or another?
Yeah, so actually, I was invited to apply. It was a TEDx UW Madison talk, and I actually completed the application while we were at our adaptive neurotechnology summer school. While we were there, that's when I completed the application, and so I had to propose my idea for a talk, including the title and kind of a summary of what I would discuss. And after I was accepted, it was an interesting back and forth of sharing my slides and kind of sharing the script of what I wanted to say. That was really different from a lot of the other talks I give. I try not to have too much of a script because I like things to be conversational, but TED has, certain standards that they want to have of their talks. And so I was coached that, you should be able to present your talk while also following a simple recipe. So it should be kind of that ingrained. You asked about the effort I put into it. I would say that it took a lot of time, but since I really enjoyed the topic and it was something that I'm passionate about, I wouldn't say it was a lot of effort. But just because I really enjoy talking about swallowing and swallowing disorders, and getting people who are outside of the field excited about it, and kind of sharing the mind-blowing things that we learn and that we do. So kind of that aspect of it, I really enjoyed. So I wouldn't call it necessarily effortful, but it did take, time to develop that. And in science, we can get kind of bogged down in the details. And so it was a really interesting kind of practice to frame it, knowing that anyone from any walk of life might hear this talk and they might have no understanding of anatomy, physiology, neural control, swallowing. They might have none of that background information. So I need to make the work, applicable or approachable to that kind of audience, but not necessarily dumb it down. And I think that's a really huge part of any kind of science, is that conveyance of it. Because you can do the best, most brilliant work in the lab, but if you can't communicate those findings, even in the case of writing a clear and easy to follow manuscript from that finding, then that work doesn't mean anything, because you're not actually conveying your findings to the broader community. And so that kind of gave me a lot of lessons in kind of that science communication and how can we convey the information not only to a lay audience, but to a more informed scientific audience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we look at the top tier journals in science, like Nature or Science, it's written in a very understandable manner. So I think the level that all scientists should look for to really be able to convey things in a very clear and understandable manner. Yes. So now our listeners will know more about this a wonderful opportunity to prepare for the talk and learn how to convey this information.
Yeah, and even if you don't give a TED Talk, it's still really good to have that skill of communicating your findings. And so, if that opportunity doesn't present it to you, there are often so if you're a student, many universities have it's called a 3-minute thesis competition. So you have to convey your thesis work in 3 minutes to a general audience. And that's also a really good exercise in okay, what are the main findings from my work and why is that impactful? And then how can I communicate that to an audience that doesn't have the background that I have? And then, 3 minutes is very short. And I think the shorter the talk, the harder it is to prepare, just because that clock is ticking and you don't have time to kind of think about what best word to use. You have to be very prepared and very rehearsed.
Yes, absolutely. But skill is amazing. And I also want to mention to our listeners that this will be helpful for them when they're preparing their grant applications. So very valuable skill. Okay. And now I have another question. We often talk in our podcast about the interrelation between art and science. And we're talking about creativity, how it is important to have this creativity, creative process in science to come up with unique solutions and ideas and approaches even to patients. And I know that you are a dancer. And I've read that you were dancing actually since you were 6 years of age. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Yes. Can you tell our listeners about that, about the impact maybe you see that it creates on your work, and also about the dance that you did? You participated in Sciences 2017 Dance, your PhD contest.
Yes. So there's a few different aspects to this. Yes, the creativity and kind of that lateral thinking is so important in science. And that can also then be applied, as we talked about, in communicating your science. It takes a lot of energy to, develop a good figure in a paper and a good slide and to, be able to have that visual representation of it. Into dance, it's something that I had done as physical activity and as an enjoyment since I was 6 and throughout high school and college and grad school. And I have a lot less time now as faculty to do it, but I still take a class every once in a while. And in science and in academic work, and really any kind of cognitive work, it can be kind of overcoming. I describe our kind of thought work as a liquid. So it will fill the amount of time you give it. So if I want to work for 18 hours a day, and in my academic work, I can't. I have enough things to do to fill that time. It's really important for us to separate out time for ourselves and time to think about other things and time to really be in the moment. And for me, dance is that. Dance is physical activity. You get the kind of emotional, spiritual connection to the music. And you have to be supremely mindful, because if you're thinking about, the only thing that you have room to think about is where your body is in space and where you're going next. And if you're not thinking about that, you're going to lose your balance and you're going to be on the floor. And so I can't think about, my lecture that I'm going to give in class tomorrow, or how I want to frame AIM 2 in this grant application. Like I can't think about that in my hour 15-minute ballet class, because I have to be there. And so it's really important in our field to carve that time out for ourselves, and in order to give us that space. For me personally, being in dance and having this experience and this kind of lifelong experience has really given me insights into motor control that I might not have had otherwise, because, I've had to be able to stand. I did point in middle school and high school. I had to be standing essentially with all my weight on my toes. And if I was on one leg, I had to do that. And I had to, have my one leg up behind me and my arms reaching out. And I had to, be able to then add a layer of emotion and kind of passion on top of that. And, then in order to move from that position to, facing a different direction with my leg in front of me, I had to be able to, change my center of gravity and to kind of shift my limbs in order to keep in balance. And so then, keep thinking about all of that has kind of helped me to really apply some of the kinesiology work and knowledge that I've gained, and then to try to apply that to the small muscles in the mouth and throat. So I think kind of having that experience, really thinking about where my body is in space and how I change it, that's helped me think about, different approaches to, how we can change the output of a small muscle in the throat. I was actually just finishing up my master's thesis, which I did I looked at kind of supralinguistic communication behaviors in people post-traumatic brain injury. So not anything relating to do with swallowing. But my thesis advisor, Lynn Turkstra, she had known I was a dancer as well. And after I had graduated with my master's and completed a thesis with her, she sent me the Dance Your PhD competition and, jokingly said, okay, this is why you have to go back and do a PhD. Dr. Turkstra was actually on my PhD committee, even though she has, somewhat of an outside specialty. And so I had that in the back of my mind. And at the time when I was a PhD student, I was dancing with a small kind of semi-professional dance company in Madison Contemporary Dance, and was able to choreograph a piece. And going into that season, I knew I wanted to do this Dance Your PhD contest. So I kind of choreographed it to kind of thinking about progression of motor signs in Parkinson's and how that approaches there. And however, I do want to give a disclaimer is that you don't need to have a dance background in order to participate and compete in the Dance Your PhD contest. And so there are lots of entries and even winning entries that come from people that do not have any dance training. But that's, again, a different way to kind of think about and communicate the findings of your science.
Thank you. And what is one thing that maybe seemed impossible at the time that you made possible in your career?
Well, I think I've always just been someone who's been, focused on the task at hand And again, as I described with that imposter syndrome, I, never really thought that I could kind of have the job of my dreams. But again, as I discussed about being at this relatively new medical school, I was able to kind of set up my position how I wanted to. And so typically with academic faculty positions in speech pathology, it's just teaching service research. But since I had this connection with a medical school that had a need for clinical services, I was able to negotiate 1 day a week of clinical work. So I still get to see patients and have that really important connection to the field that I still have. And so I think kind of the power in that and the lesson I learned is that, it's really important to advocate for the things that you want, even though you might think that it's not going to be possible, and to, really hone those negotiation skills because, if you don't ask for it, then it's not possible. But you might be surprised with the, leeway that even, the ivory tower, these classic institutions that you may be able to get, and to really, again, know the why for what you're doing. So I was able to really communicate, why it's important for me to be able to continue to see patients and to practice those clinical skills, and then to, have that connection with my research program and the patients that I see. So, to be able to clearly communicate, the reasoning for why you're asking for what you're asking can help, convince the decision makers.
Absolutely. And the last question, if somebody wants to get in touch with you and to learn more about the work you do, how they can do it. And we also will add this information to our podcast notes.
Certainly. Well, my email is freely accessible on the UT website. It's my name, Corinne.Jones at austin.utexas. I love geeking out about swallowing and swallowing disorders and Parkinson's and technologies and machine learning, the little that I understand about machine learning with people, and kind of, having these conversations that develops new ideas for me. It develops new ideas for whoever I'm communicating with. So feel free to reach out. I am behind the times on social media, so I don't have a Twitter. I'm still working on my lab's website, but I am very accessible by email and happy to set up a time to chat and to geek out.
Thank you so much, Corinne. It was a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you for taking time and telling us all this amazing stuff about language and speech pathology and technologies and the development. So I'm sure our listeners will appreciate that very, very much. So thank you.
Yes, so happy to catch up with you and to share the things that occupy a lot of my mind space.
Thank you. Bye-bye.